The idea of isolation and loneliness, particularly in Australia, is massive. People are gradually losing the ability to sit and do this. I was always actively interested in the internal worlds of other people.
What are specific needs and wants they have from a mental health point of view or psychological needs?
I've worked with people who are at acute risk of suicide. Sometimes when people are extremely depressed or very anxious, they might have lost sight of that path.
You have AI porn. You are more in control. And then it's sickening in some way that you are controlling another human being in a way.
It takes away some of the difficulty of human relationships. You don't risk getting turned down. You don't risk getting rejected. And we as a society, highly rejection-sensitive. The world of AI would have us believe that you're never going to hear no. You'll never feel disappointment, right? You can have this utopian image of a relationship on your terms exactly as you want it, and none of the messy negotiation, none of the messy feelings is going to come with that.
Before we get started, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode of our cutting-edge contemporary conversations. Thank you.
Welcome, Bronwyn. How are you?
I'm great, Dave. Thank you. How are you?
Doing very well. Thank you for your time today, and it's a privilege to sit with you today.
Pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
And as I was going through your long profile, there's a bit of work you have done, but I would like for you to share with me a bit more about your story and how you end up into this space and this career as a young person, and how you evolved to this person you are.
Yeah, so the history is long now. It's 30 years in psychology. So I think I was always actively interested as a young person in the internal worlds of other people. And I think my mum decided it would be a great career choice. And in the absence of knowing what else to do in year 12, I kind of headed down that path. It's been an incredible career. I've been fortunate enough to do lots of different jobs in lots of different settings and work across industries. So I've been very blessed with the opportunities that I've had.
Could you talk about the mindset of a psychologist? The mindset of being keen into people and then valuing how people think, they behave, the needs and the wants. What kind of a mindset do you have to be good in what you do?
Well, I think, curiosity is got to be the primary thing that brings you to the work, I guess. I think also if you talk to most psychologists, and depending on what sort of specialty they have or what area they work in, they will often have a strong drive to ease the suffering of other people. So often quite strong values around compassion. You have to be good at maths, which no one warned me about. But you have to be able to read and understand research, which you're taught to do at university, obviously. But you have to be genuinely curious about the inner worlds of people, I think. And I think what makes really good psychologists is those that are collaborative and I think often strength-based. So yes, I think as a psychologist you can bring a lot of academic understanding, a lot of theory, a lot of principles, research-backed interventions. But at the end of the day, you're also on a journey with your patient or your client, depending on who that is, to find for them a place where they can realise their potential. And I think that's probably the characteristics of most psychologists. We are working with people to progress something, to help them find their place, to help them find their purpose, to help them realise their potential. I think that sort of drive is also critically important for a psychologist.
And as you have evolved in your career, what kind of demographics or cohorts of people you liked working with, and what have you observed for those cohorts in terms of what are specific needs and wants they have from a mental health point of view or psychological needs?
Yeah, well, as part of my clinical training, we have to work pretty much across the lifespan. So part of our practicum is to do that. I spent a long time working in youth mental health in various forums and have always really enjoyed that. Part of the reason I liked it is because I think I really enjoyed the optimism of working with that cohort, and I certainly enjoyed being connected to the subcultures of young people that I worked with. It's always really fascinating and a lot of fun. I have, done lots of different work in lots of different ways. I've worked with people who are at acute risk of suicide, also incredibly rewarding work, very challenging work. But the journey of supporting someone in psychotherapy who is acutely suicidal is, although challenging, it's incredibly rewarding, because I think there is always a path through. And I think sometimes when people are extremely depressed or very anxious, they might have lost sight of that path. And I think part of the role of the therapist in those instances is to walk alongside the person and help them rediscover that path, whatever it looks like for them. So, in a way, it's very hopeful work also. And currently my work is predominantly working with the people who do the caring. So it's working with health professionals, but it's also working with other professionals and leaders around their own mental health and resilience.
Can I ask you to give me a bit more your understanding? Because people who are acutely in the wrong space for whatever reasons, they're suicidal, and then as a practitioner, you have enough time to interact and then assessments and then support the person in the right format, and it's more research-driven, evidence-based, and all of that is available at your fingertips, so you can take a conscious and right judgment. But on the flip side, when the services like Lifeline or any of these services where people are calling when they are in that headspace, and the person on the other side might not be a psychologist, and then it's very, I don't know how would they manage those conversations, because they're difficult ones to start with. What do you see the difference between that first-hand interaction or first point of contact interaction, somebody who's not in the right headspace, whereas versus you have, and at your practice, you might have longer time and interaction. It's more controlled environment, whereas this is uncontrolled environment. You can't control the factors, and without the right skill sets of psychologist or a psychiatrist. So how do you see that operating from a positive outcomes in the end for the client or the patient?
Yeah, look, I think everybody has a role to play along that continuum, right? So I think I would say about the work that Lifeline do is people are incredibly highly trained in that scenario, and also highly compassionate. But everybody's got a role to play in terms of suicide intervention, and I think it comes with the whole community recognising that mental ill health or struggling isn't the domain of one person or one gender or one cohort of society. Human suffering comes from everywhere, really. And so we can all be human in that moment, and we can all reach out to check. Bearing in mind that sometimes when people are acutely suicidal and or have been very depressed for a long time, actually actively help seeking is sometimes very difficult. So everyone has a role to play if they notice that behaviour has changed in a friend or family member, just to open up a conversation around that, right? And that's one thing we can all do. So you don't seem like yourself, what's going on? And even being able to kind of just leave the door open if the person isn't open to speaking then and there. So, yeah, you don't have to be a trained psychologist. You don't even have to be a trained Lifeline person. Everybody can support and intervene in that way, I guess.
And you also talked about when you were working with the young people, you were very intrigued by the subcultures. I would like to know more what subcultures you were referring to, and what are your observations on those subcultures as well?
That's going back a little while, Dev. So You're really stretching my memory banks. I think there was a variety of subcultures. So certainly had some young people that I worked with who were part of goth subcultures, which was always really interesting. And I think certainly the clients that I had at that time were intrinsically very highly self-reflective and and very sensitive to their own inner worlds and the inner worlds of people around them. So, but yeah, that's a really interesting subculture. And I always think the work with young people, I mean, they're so in touch a lot of the time and more than people give them credit for. I think they're super aware of what's happening in their environment and in the world, and so are deeply affected existentially by those issues. So I think if you spend long enough with any young person, you'll learn that. So, look, there were lots of different subcultures at the time, and it's, we're going back 30 years, so whatever was in vogue back then was probably the thing that I was working with, yeah.
Interestingly, I think the subcultures do exist in across all decades and time periods. And it has probably been amplified because of social media, and people and algorithms in your tools, in your platform can push you through a subculture. If you are watching a kind of content, you can be in that echo chamber, and that experience is more amplified. So how do you, and every subculture will bring good and bad. Once, yes, you are very observant of yourself, you know who you are, what you want to be, and hence you are part of that subculture or that kind of format. But it is amplified through the algorithmic power of those tools you're using. And how do you see that mental health point of view if somebody is in that subculture or trying to come out of that cycle, vicious circle of that going in and coming out or staying in for longer? And if the net outcome we want as a positive outcome for that person to be not in that subculture, just to be coming out of that virtual space, what kind of intervention and what kind of work needs to be done with that person?
Well, not all subcultures are bad, right? Yeah. And I think, they're often highly developmentally appropriate for young people because they often enter a subculture, whatever that looks like, as a way of battling or finding or coming to terms with their own independence and their own identity. So it's a healthy developmental stage to kind of find yourself a group of friends that feel like you feel like understand you and that you belong in, I guess. So, not all subcultures are bad necessarily. And I think, there are now restrictions on young people's ability to access social media in Australia. So I think that definitely impacts. Can we limit that entirely? Can we limit young people's exposure to various messaging? Probably not. And that's where it kind of gets down to real connection with trusted friends and family around, encouraging young people to have a healthy ability to evaluate the information that they're being given in any platform, I suppose. And, we can all encourage critical thinking skills in each other by having open dialogue around things, but particularly in young people too, that they're not deliberately feeding into ideologies that are potentially harmful, or to evaluate that. So I think particularly around the issue of, disordered eating and the imagery that people get about the norms that they're supposed to conform to in terms of body image and size and height and weight. And it's not just young people now, it's young women now, it's young men as well. There is a lot of pressure around those sorts of things. And again, it's about how do we help young people develop the ability to critically evaluate the information they're being given. Yeah. In
your observation, what are you seeing? I don't know. I think I will go to different demographics, but I want to stick with the young for now.
Sure.
But we will. I had another one to follow up on that. What kind of trends you're seeing in terms of beyond eating disorders or that kind of content being pushed on socials, or body image issues for both boys and girls? What other kind of subcategories of anxiety triggers, or what are you observing in general?
Well, I mean, it's not a cohort that I work with anymore, but I think, some of what I observe is, I think people, online bullying still exists, and that's part of the reason I think that the social media laws have come into effect in Australia is to prevent that. But that doesn't mean that, people over the age of 16 aren't subject to that too. Yeah. So when we talk about young people, typically we're kind of talking about anywhere between 12 and 24, really, that cohort. And so, there is still scope for people to be very impacted by negative messaging on social media. Again, it's how do we encourage people, really, of all ages to kind of, not evaluate themselves through, one platform or one set of messages, that they don't take on the criticism, they don't take on the bullying, they don't take on the interpretation of other people's worlds, because, it's all very well for keyboard warriors to sit behind their screens and
be anonymous.
Exactly, and negatively evaluate other people without looking in their own backyards first. So, yeah, I think it's part of the skill we all need to learn if we're going to interact with social media is how to kind of critically evaluate that information and not internalize some of the messaging. Right?
What happens with most of the influencers is they start with their own niche, but once they find what works and they want to do more of what works.
Yeah.
What works is probably, again, aggression and assertiveness and then ripping somebody apart and then giving their views. Good, bad and ugly doesn't make a difference, but that's what they're getting hooked onto.
Yeah,
so they are themselves getting down the same cycle of, you was independent and different and you were doing something creative first, but then you saw the audiences increasing because of that content. And then you do more of that content.
It's reinforcing in and of itself, isn't it, really? Yeah. And it's, kindness and compassion are not things that catch the algorithm's attention, I guess.
No. If you can start shouting to the camera, it'll go fast and wild.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can start abusing the Prime Minister or whoever.
Yeah, that's the stuff that gets people's attention, right?
Of the work within the broader mental health space. One is the population at large, and is the work in the corporates. So how do you see broader trends on mental health generally? We are in the post-COVID era. We've already gone through 2-3 years of post-COVID. The people haven't understood. They are working from home. They have dual lives. They are trying to have a good work and life balance because they're working from home. So they are more independent. So what do you see from a corporate point of view and population at large mental health trends?
Yeah, I think I can go to the second point first. Over the last 30 years, I've seen increased literacy and awareness around mental health. So we seem to be much more comfortable in this day and age talking about mental health like we would physical health.
Yeah.
But that's taken a long time, really. It's taken a long time for there to kind of be nuanced language and understanding around what it means to, have an anxiety disorder versus what it means to be depressed or, particularly the issue of neurodivergence now, I think has a lot of discussion around it. And there's some acceptance, that, people can be incredibly neurodivergent without necessarily meeting the criteria for a particular, what we'd say, a particular disorder, for instance. But I think I'm hoping, and it appears to me as a psychologist, there's a lot more literacy and discussion around those things and normalising of those things than there was 30 years ago. To the issue around what's happening kind of in corporate and the workforce, similarly, I think, there is increasing recognition that the world of work is inherently tied to our mental health. People seek out work because it provides purpose and it provides a sense of identity. And of course, with that comes all of the stuff that's attached to psychology and mental health and relationship building in that space. So what do I see in terms of the trends corporately? Well, I think the landscape in Australia has changed, particularly in the last 5 years. Part of that's driven through the changes to work health and safety legislation, that employers now have to manage the psychosocial hazards in their workplaces in the same way that they was any physical hazard, for instance. I think that's changed the conversation. But also I think when workers come to work, they are increasingly aware of their own mental health at work. What does that look like? We're now much more comfortable with talking about stress and burnout at work.
Yep.
When I first started as a junior psych, you'd never speak about those things, even if you did feel burnt out. So I think a lot of that stuff was hidden and not well addressed, whereas I think we have way better mechanisms for encouraging people to kind of come forward, and better support mechanisms available in the world of work too around people's mental health.
Because every sector will bring a different kind of workplace challenges. If you are a nurse in an emergency department, will create a different challenge versus if you are a miner on a mine site, will have a different set of challenges versus if you are a property agent selling property on Saturdays and Sundays, not seeing your kids.
Exactly.
So how do you customize in terms of understanding of that the organization have some corporate responsibility towards or duty of care towards their employees in terms of providing them a safe space to deliver the outcomes or deliver the job description they have been assigned to. So how do you solve that problem? How do you start when there is nothing in the organization?
How long have we got?
Take your time.
I think it's thinking about the organisation and the individuals in it from a systems perspective. And what I mean by that is, if you bring a systems lens to any organisation, it's about, operating from the principle that the system is larger than the sum of its parts. So that means that individuals interact with each other in the system and they interact with the system at large. And so when you are thinking about organisations, you are thinking about that system, if you like, an organisation, within the other systems that are bearing down on that too. So, there's kind of socio-cultural and socio-technological influences on organisations. And then it's thinking about the people that are inside that organisation that are kind of creating the moving parts that go towards thinking about that. So, yeah, you're right. Every organisation faces different psychosocial pressures, I guess, and has different and unique psychosocial challenges. But, at the end of the day, people are also people and they want to be able to go to work safely and do their jobs safely. And by and large, I think organisations are also extremely aware that their greatest asset and value is their people. And so finding ways to kind of help people work safely and productively and with a sense of satisfaction is certainly in the interests of every organisation's bottom line, I would have thought.
How do you see the pandemic of social isolation for different age groups, whether it's elderly Australians, whether it's young Australians, whether it's people who are living by themselves? How do you see that social isolation as a challenge, as a pressure on communities?
I think it is the greatest challenge potentially that we have to face in Australia. I, as a psychotherapist, practice very much from a relational base. So, a lot of my way of thinking about mental ill health is in terms of people's relational capacities. So, what are the quality of their relationships like? How many significant relationships do they have? What ways do they have of getting and sustaining relationships? So I think the idea of isolation and loneliness, particularly in Australia, is massive. And I think that goes across the board. And I think going back to your earlier point around social media for young people, I think that's a significant driver of loneliness too, right? Again, because people are gradually it seems to me, losing the ability to sit and do this, to have a conversation, to sit in the presence of another human being and understand each other's worldviews. So, and I think Australia, for all our wish to be easygoing and laid back, we are an incredibly isolated well, not only an isolated country, but we're socially isolated. And particularly I notice in Perth, having spent time in Europe, about how little we actually connect with our neighbours. You know, we are not popping down to the bistro on the corner and, having a glass of wine with someone. There are no bistros to pop down to on the corner. There's no, often, even to pop down to the nearest pub is, a drive away. So we don't necessarily have places to collect as community, I suppose. Little high streets that we would in Europe, or bistros or cafes, or we don't talk to our neighbours much. So I think, our built environment too answers for a lot of the disconnect we feel in Australia. We have enormous houses that are separated from one another. So, I think all of that plays into our sense of disconnect from one another.
And on the social isolation, I watched a couple of documentaries on AI partners or AI girlfriends and boyfriends, both ways. And they were tracking a couple of individuals on their interactions with AI partners for 9 or 12 months or 2 years. And there was this one young person who was interacting with an AI partner, and through the rabbit hole of interacting with AI tools, one is it's good for some age brackets when you're already isolated, you want to have interaction. So the positive was people who are isolated, it's good to interact.
Sure.
And there is a positive interaction. But on the other side, people who are healthy and have their own social circle, when they go down the rabbit hole of AI partners or girlfriends or partners, they go through the rabbit hole of isolating themselves. And this person was neurodivergent. They were girl, and then they became non-binary on the pathway because the partner was all-affirming. It was not a psychologist. It wasn't, and one thing which they said, that the AI tool prompted the person to be, what if you are this? What if you are this? What if you are this? In terms of self-identifying and self-journey or self-research and all that stuff. And it was very interesting to see that this person had screens in all the rooms with the AI avatar on, and whichever room this person was moving around, it was interacting with the tool all the time, every time. And if they meant to see their family, the phone was on, the tool was on the phone, and the AI partner was listening to them as they are interacting, and they're having a three-way conversation. So how do you see that interaction? Because human relationships are, I might not agree with you all the time. We will change, we will have facial expressions, we not be happy and not happy. But if I have a tool which is all affirming, all happy all the time, and all pepped up all the time, so what do you see where that subculture, you can say, going?
Yeah. How I see that is dismally. I think, in terms of what we know about human attachment, starting from the time that we are born, that, real eye gaze in real time, and, the felt presence of another human being, and, small hand gestures and interactions, the way that we make eye contact, our brains are kind of wired for that. We are extremely social animals, and I kind of worry about what that looks like in the future. The idea that it's all affirming and it's always great. I mean, there's a lot of conversation at the moment about, AI never really challenging people on their positions, which is not how healthy relationships work in real time and with real people, right? It's good to be challenged. It's good to kind of have your ideas questioned. Goes back to the idea about thinking about the world critically in a way. Yeah, I worry deeply about that. And, you know, there's a tendency for people to sort of say, well, you know, I don't really need my therapist anymore because I've got ChatGPT. And, you know, I mean, you know, my ultimate aim is to be done out of a job. I think that would be amazing if everybody's mental health was such that they no longer needed a therapist. But at the end of the day, part of what sitting with a therapist does for you is the eye gaze, is having someone mirror your emotions, understand your internal worlds, understand your history, from where you've come from and the patterns of your relating to other people, and to help you work through that in a real relationship with another human being. Whereas, you know, no matter how good the avatar is, it's, you know, it's never going to kind of give that felt presence, I don't think.
And then just to... because again, for me, it's a rabbit hole of watching more documentaries. I love watching documentaries. And the next iteration of AI Girlfriend was, in the same series or documentary, was AI porn. So when you have actors who are doing, you know, things which are not normal, but when you have porn, you can tell the tool to do whatever, in whatever location,
completely,
whatever scenery, and then you are more in control. And it's sickening in some way that you are controlling another human being in a way. You're controlling that, you know, the scene, so-called scene you want to play. And I don't know, can you assess that for me? It's not sitting well with me, and I can't understand why is that human behavior more, people are leaning towards that.
Well, again, I think it takes away some of the difficulty of human relationships, right? So my mind immediately goes to the issue of consent. You don't have to navigate consent, do you, if you've got an avatar? And consent is a tricky conversation for everybody to have in a sexual relationship. But it's a super important one, and that's a skill that everybody needs to develop, right? So... but it's just easier if you have an avatar, right? You don't risk getting turned down. You don't risk getting rejected. And we are, as a society, highly rejection-sensitive, I think, too. So if you are engaging with a real-life human being, there is a chance that they could reject your sexual advances. Avatars aren't likely to do that if you program them a certain way. And so you never have to hear disappointment. You never have to work with being wounded in a way around rejection. And I think it's something people already struggle with. You know, if they are rejected or turned down already, people don't like that. And they're, you know, I think we're losing skills on how we deal with that. Yeah, it's okay for people to say no, and it doesn't necessarily make the other person a bad human being, doesn't make you a bad human being. People are entitled to choose what they want to do. But increasingly the world of AI would have us believe that you're never going to hear no. You'll never feel disappointment, right? You can have this utopian image of a relationship on your terms exactly as you want it, and none of the messy negotiation, none of the messy feelings, none of the messy hurt and disappointment or bruised ego is going to come with that.
And this person is available all the time. So if I'm sending a message to this app and it'll respond,
this person never has a headache. This person never has, 5 washing loads to get onto the line, or 3 kids screaming.
It's just unachievable. Absolutely. It's unrealistic in terms of the interaction and the relational dynamic that it establishes, I think, or the expectation that that's how relationships are going to go. And I was interacting with ChatGPT voice. So I interacted with, because it has voice when you do a premium versus a free one. And I've used all the time, and it was probably a couple of days I've consumed all the number of minutes I wanted to use for the premium, and then it came back to the normal one. And I felt, no, I want to talk to that voice. Because that voice, but I knew that it is wrong, but that voice is more accustomed to that voice. And then change of voice also impacted that because I'm giving prompts and coming back. So what if I do that for 6 months or 1 year? So it was a good understanding for me to see that, anybody who can think that they are mentally well, they might go, everybody are susceptible to go into the rabbit hole.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think there is absolutely a time and a place for AI, and there is a time and a place in terms of us checking our understanding, but you have to know how to use it as a tool too.
Yeah.
So, and certainly in my work, I do use it, but I'm, for instance, writing things and then getting it to scan literature in the background. You have to use it judiciously and in a certain way, right? So the other thing I'm concerned about is, again, we're kind of losing this ability to critically think for ourselves and analyse. It's very easy to write an assignment based on what ChatGPT tells you, rather than actually do the hard yards of sitting with 15 articles and trawling through them and coming up with your own conclusion. And then maybe using AI in the background to say, oh, did I get that reference right, or can you find some other papers that author might have written? But to use it instead of actually thinking, getting our neurons to fire, something I'd be very deeply concerned about.
I've done a lot of work within the care sector. You have care workers, support workers, aged care workers, and because they are the front end of delivery of care to vulnerable Australians, whether they have disability, whether they're elderly, and there's these terms being used, trauma-informed care, and all those terms around that. How do you manage the mental health of people who are caring all the time? Because I think everybody has a window and they get pushed into darker spaces, because I think everybody has a limited capacity to deliver care and then be empathetic all the time. So what's the research on that? How do we, if you're working in care space, do you have enough empathy in you and which you finishes off, or you are drained out of the empathy and then you become different, or what's the research on that side?
So in human-based services, we certainly talk a lot about the idea about compassion fatigue. I think that's a fairly well-known term now, but it is certainly that idea that when we are in work in particular that requires us to be attuned to the inner worlds of other people, that requires kind of cognitive and emotional resources, that if we are not careful about how we look after ourselves, those sorts of resources become depleted, really. So it's the idea that whatever is happening to us externally is outstripping our internal resources around these sorts of things. So compassion fatigues are really a significant issue, I think, in caring professions. And so is, we talk about secondary and vicarious trauma. So it's where, in some types of work, people are exposed to traumatic material or the trauma of other people, which, also requires cognitive and emotional resources to be able to sit with that. So in the case of disability workers, for instance, or nursing staff, for instance, it requires the ability to kind of bear witness to trauma in other people, which, again, is a load for people. So, there are lots of different industries in which compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma exist. And again, it's a thing that we have to be mindful of in terms of how we structure people's work to be able to ensure that people have sufficient rest, that they are not carrying loads, caseloads, for instance, of clients who have particularly traumatic and difficult histories, and that we make sure that, the structure of people's work is such that they can be adequately rested from being exposed to, the secondary trauma in their clients.
from a point of view of small and mid-sized organizations who don't have chief psychologist or those kind of roles internally, but they are working in the OSH environment, they want to work towards positive mental health for their all employees. Where should they start? What should be the chapter 1 of the opening book? How should they implement good working safer spaces for their employees to be more productive and efficient?
I mean, I think it because I'm a psychologist, I'm going to say always your first point is assessing and understanding your landscape, right? So I think for every organisation, having some form of psychosocial risk assessment so they understand the particular psychosocial risks that they're dealing with in their organisation and their industry is a good starting point. I would encourage every organisation to think about mental health on the continuum. So there is kind of healthy functioning at one end. And then we see kind of increasing levels of distress at the other to the point of, anxiety, burnout, PTSD, those sorts of things. And remembering that exposure is cumulative too. So the more we kind of expose people to stressful circumstances, the more likely they are to kind of develop disorders as they go along. So for organisations, thinking about your points of intervention along any part of that continuum is important. So what you do in the preventative space is equally important as to ensuring that you have good strategies at the pointy end, which is probably the area that I work in terms of people's mental health. So when they do start to show signs of burnout or distress, being able to make sure that those people can get adequate help and get it quickly. A lot of organisations will have a third-party employee assistance provider. So that's good, again, for that kind of pointy end. But, I'd also encourage small and mid-sized organisations to think about what they do at the front end. And that means being a little more nuanced than offering yoga once a month, So it's actually about understanding the inherent risks of the work that you're asking people to do from a psychosocial perspective and then designing your workplace strategy around that. Yeah,
I think that's more deep and meaningful than just having the same tool used everywhere. You can't...
Absolutely, yeah. And because like you pointed out earlier, every industry is going to be slightly different in terms of the psychosocial risks that they're working with. A lot of my work at the moment is with health professionals. And so again, we're talking about secondary and vicarious trauma. We're talking about, you and I spoke off camera earlier about the idea about moral injury, particularly when people are feeling like they can't deliver the sorts of care that they would like to deliver to their patients or clients. In mining, it's a different set of psychosocial hazards again. So working conditions sometimes from a psychological perspective impact on that. But also it's the sense of isolation, and FIFO work in Western Australia brings its own set of challenges, right, to relationships, family, all of those sorts of things.
I would be very interested in somebody could do kind of research for, health outcomes for young kids, comparing separated families versus FIFO families, because one parent is absent for 2 weeks. And then, so I don't know whether there could be parallels between, but I think there could be some research done that because one of the parents is absent for longer duration versus you have health outcomes which are not positive for broken families versus, is that similar for FIFO families or not?
For sure, yeah. No, I don't know, but I think it would be an interesting area of research because, look, I'm sure other countries struggle with FIFO issues too, but, I can only talk about Western Australia. Yeah, and, we've got an entire state built around FIFO, right, which is fairly unique position, I think, in terms of, Australia and the world, I guess. So
you can shout out to all the mining companies, put some money on the research.
Exactly. To look at the impact, I mean, having said that, I do think increasingly, as I kind of, I certainly work with people who are FIFO in psychotherapy now, and I And I did a million years ago around the time the earth cooled, I had a job with an EAP actually, and, we were contracted to mining companies then too. And I do think there's a shift in landscape around that. So I think in terms of attracting and retaining staff, mining companies are much more onto the idea about how do we provide childcare, how do we actually build towns so that people want to live in them, so they're not having to fly in and fly out all the time. They can go home at night to their kids. So I think organisations increasingly are beginning to think about that. It's definitely an investment when you've kind of got happy, productive workforce. It's a much more stable workforce, isn't it? And again, that's got to be better for the bottom line, I guess. Yeah.
And I think if you can talk about as an employee working in a difficult environment, whether it's healthcare, whether it's front-end mining, whether it's hardcore sales roles, what kind of top 3 things one need to know and aware about their own mental health? Because sometimes we are in an echo chamber. We might ignore that this has become some behaviors might be normalized in that organization or that sector. So how most of the employees or people can be aware of that this is those signs of picking up that I might be going down to the path of not positive path, down to bad mental health.
Yeah, I think there's several skills we can all develop internally to kind of just, keep having conversations with ourselves about how we're tracking in terms of our mental health and bringing awareness to the demands that we're under. Yes, demands that exist at work, but they exist in other aspects of our lives too. I think the first thing we need to develop is the ability to observe ourselves. So the ability to kind of understand and know what's a normal baseline for you. For instance, some people really struggle and notice their mental health decline when they get only 6 or 7 hours sleep as opposed to 8 or 9. Other people thrive absolutely fine on 5 or 6, and no questions asked. So I think it's about understanding your own baseline, being able to observe yourself first of all, and I think it's about also then developing some strategies to know how to resource yourself when things are difficult or hard. So you may know, for instance, that you're going into a busy period of work. Rather than waiting till you get to the end of that busy period and know that you're exhausted, it's thinking about, well, what do I need to put in place now that might help? And it's all the really boring stuff, and this is going to be of no surprise to anyone, but it is things like, regulating your sleep, whatever that looks like for you, because we know that poor mental health is intrinsically tied to poor sleep. So if you correct that, you correct a lot of what happens from a psychological perspective. Good diet, your brain requires good levels of protein, carbohydrate, glucose just to function at a basic level every single day. So, diet is hugely important to the way that you function from a neurological perspective. And from an energy perspective, right? So actually having enough energy to kind of greet the day, and do all of those things, getting, being careful with sunlight, but getting enough sunlight so that we can actually, have enough cortisol in the morning to rise and do the things that we need to do to have a productive day. So putting that stuff into place early before you get stressed and worn out is hugely important. And the next thing is, again, we're social animals. So knowing who your points of connection are, knowing that you've got at least 1 or 2 people that you can go to and talk to when things are tough and be able to share those experiences. And when it comes to work, knowing how to escalate those sorts of things when it feels like it's beginning to be too much. We maybe you're starting to act in ways that you wouldn't normally act. So you become a bit snappier, or you find yourself being incredibly short-tempered with people, which is unlike you. You find yourself not concentrating or rushing through things. Being able to go to someone at work and say, this is not like me. I don't know what's happening, but I'd like some help to figure that out. And generally it'll be your line manager if you have a good relationship with them. Or again, you can go to your work health and safety team and often say, I noticed that I'm not functioning as I normally would. I'm under a lot of pressure. Is there someone who can help me with next steps from here?
Thank you, Bronwyn, for your time today.
It's been a pleasure, Dev. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.